What flies do you need if you actually want to catch some fish this winter? Well, we know that our fake flies just imitate the real-life aquatic insects that make up a majority of a fish's diet. So your fly selection in winter should reflect the bugs that are active during the coldest months of the year. But are there even any bugs active in the winter? Or do they just hold up inside, curled up on their bug couch watching basketball? On today's episode of Untangled, I'll walk you through what bugs actually are active during the winter and a few of the flies you should have on hand if you want to put some fish in the net. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. A question that I hear all the time is something along the lines of, well, what fly should I use? Or what flies are the fish hitting on right now? And if you've listened to Untangled at all, or you've watched any of the content that we put out here at VFC, then you know that question's, it's really incomplete. In fact, I'd even go so far as to call it lazy, almost, because it doesn't really get to the heart of what it is that you want to know, which is what bugs are active right now and what flies do I need to imitate them? Because at the end of the day, that's your goal as a fly angler. None of this other stuff matters. The knots, the presentation, the mending, the casting, that's all important, but none of that matters a lick if you can't get your flies in front of fish and make them look real. That's your goal as a fly angler. It's really pretty simple when you boil it all down. Put your flies in front of fish, make them look real. Now, I could just go ahead and tell you, well, here's what to use in the winter. But if I tell you that, I don't explain any of the why behind it, then next winter's going to roll around. You're going to be in that same boat where you're asking that question, well, what do I use? And then it's an incomplete question again because you haven't understood the why. So I'm going to start out the show today with an overview of what bugs are actually active during the winter. Then we'll move on to my list of flies. And I've actually got some bass flies in the list today too. So stick around for that. But I just want to hammer home how important it is to understand the why behind this stuff, because once you understand, okay, these are the bugs that I need to imitate during the winter, then it's really easy to look in your fly box or go to a fly shop or order flies from VFC and get the flies you need to match those bugs. It eliminates 99% of the guesswork once you know the bugs that are out there, and it makes you a more complete angler. It makes you an angler who's well-rounded, somebody who can go to the river and confidently get into fish on a consistent basis. And that's what we want you to be. That's why we do everything we do here at VFC, is to help you become that angler and to have that experience where you're not relying on somebody else to help get you into fish, where you can do it yourself. So in the spirit of that, let's take a look at what bugs are actually active during winter. And we're going to start out with our midges, because this is the only aquatic insect that is actually very active in the winter at all. And midges, they're a real small bug. The adult versions of them look just like a mosquito, except the nice thing is midges don't bite. They don't suck your blood. They're not little vampire SOBs. They're there to feed the fish, and you'll swallow a few from time to time. That'll just happen as you fly fish. They don't taste too bad. I'll tell you what doesn't taste good is a caddis or a yellow Sally, any stonefly that gets down in your throat. They just kind of tickle a little bit. Oh, and it's kind of, you dream about fishing these hatches, right? About being in that blanket hatch, and it sounds amazing, and it is. It's a wonderful experience. Every angler should have that experience. But the things we don't talk about is how uncomfortable it is to have 1,000 bugs crawling all over you and going in your mouth and trying to go up your nose and behind your sunglasses. It's really awkward sometimes. But thankfully in the winter, you don't have to worry about that, because midges are about the only thing that's really going to be active in the winter as far as a bug that's actually going to hatch above the surface. Your caddis, your mayflies, your stoneflies, they're not doing anything in the winter. Midges are the only ones. They start out, and hopefully I get this right, they start out as a pupa, and then they go into a larva, and then they go into the adult form, and they lay their eggs and die back on the water. That's your very brief midge life cycle. But even though they're very small, midges make up something like 50% of a trout's diet in some watersheds. So they're very important, and they're in every single river. And when it's winter and they're it's like they're the only game in town. Like I grew up in, I grew up in Utah, and felt like unless you moved to Utah from somewhere else, you were a fan of the Utah Jazz, because up until recently, they were the only professional gig in town. Now, we could talk all day long whether you're a Utes fan or a Cougars fan when it comes to college football, but Utah Jazz, they're the only game in town. You cheer for them. Well, that's how the Fish treat the Midges in the winter. It's the only game in town, so they're going to focus on them. And of course, there's other things. Utah had minor league hockey, and we'll get into some of the other stuff that goes into this. Some of the other bugs that are active as well. But midges are going to make up the bulk of a fish's diet in the winter, just because that's the bug that's active. And again, that's the only bug you're going to see actually hatching during the winter. So you can fish dry flies in the winter and catch fish on dry flies. I like to do that when I get the opportunity to do it. Alex makes fun of me sometimes because he'll be nymphing a run and he'll be catching a lot of big fish and he's having a great time. And I'm over in some eddy with 7X tippet and a size 24 trying to convince a fish to eat. But that's what's so great about fly fishing is you can do it however brings you the most enjoyment. And for me, that tends to be dry flies a lot of the time. But anyways, your midges, very important bug. And we've got midge imitations on this list, but any of your midge imitations, you want those in your box for the winter. Zebra midges, demon midges, midge adults, anything you can think of, all sorts of different life cycle stages. You're going to want them. They're very important this time of year. Now, there are some other bugs that are active this time of year. They're not technically insects, and I use the term insect and bug interchangeably, and I actually got I don't know if it was meant to be mean. I think it was in jest, but a scientist actually was watching one of our videos. I know, right? A scientist watching Untangled, but it happened, and they let me know that I used insect and bug incorrectly because they're not the same thing, and I'm aware of that. But I'm just going to use them interchangeably, so I'm not repeating the same phrase over and over and over. And anyways, the other bugs that are going to be out there. These bugs never hatch, so there are no dry fly versions of them. They live their entire life cycle underwater. They're nymphs all the time. That's going to be your scuds and sow bugs, your worms, and then we'll throw eggs in here too. Even though they're not a bug, they're nowhere near a bug, but they're a fly that works very well during the winter, so we're going to lump them in with this as well. Your scuds and your sow bugs, these are basically mini freshwater shrimp. That's the best way to think of them. They're like the aquatic versions of your roly-poly or your potato bugs. If you ever played with those as a kid, they are active year-round. You will catch fish on scuds, sow bugs all year long, and fish will eat them any season. But in the winter, again, when your caddis, your mayflies, your stoneflies, the terrestrials, they're not doing anything. The scuds become a much bigger part of the diet. They become a much bigger focus because, back to the sports analogy, along with the midges, they're really the only game in town. That's about all the fish got to eat. It's scud or starve. And I'll tell you what, fish ain't going to starve. They're not picky like me. Well, I mean, they are sometimes. But they're going to eat. They're not going to just not eat. Okay. And again, while scuds and sow bugs are technically different, they are very similar in their size, their shape, and their color. So the flies that we're going to use to imitate them, they're going to be very similar as well. And the same goes for worms. The worms that we're imitating in fly fishing aren't always the night crawlers that you buy to go bait fishing with. That you've got rough memories of spearing on a bait hook when you were a little kid. If you're anything like me, I got so squeamish about it. I can field dress an elk or a deer now and it doesn't bother me. But I remember as a little kid, I used to just have the darndest time trying to put a worm on a hook because I felt so squeamish about it. I almost always have my dad do it for me. But anyways, night crawlers, those big earthworm types, they will end up in the river at times. But there are aquatic worms that live in the rivers and in the mud and whatnot. And often they tend to be a little bit shorter, not nearly as fat sometimes. So those are the worms that we're imitating with our worm patterns. That's why you don't see a giant earthworm style fly pattern. It's just, think too how much of a pain that would be to tie, how much of a pain that would be to cast and fish. It's just a lot easier to go with the shorter ones. Now, I mentioned eggs falling into this category as well. And they're a little bit different because eggs are not a bug and they're not an insect. They're not alive, but they are going to be available in the early winter and then again in late winter when there are different fish spawning. So in the fall, you've got your brook trout and your brown trout that'll spawn. And I've caught, there's even some late spawning rainbow trout strains that exist out there for different management purposes. And even after the spawn's over, you can catch fish pretty consistently on eggs because the fish have gotten used to them floating through the water. And so the fish will go ahead and eat them. And then late winter, you've got your rainbow trout that'll start spawning again. Some other spring spawning fish will start. And right on that verge of spring and winter, you can fish eggs again. But even if there aren't any fish actively spawning at the time, eggs work as a great attractor pattern too. And an attractor pattern, think of it like when you were back in high school and there was a girl you really wanted to impress. So you put on your best duds. You were that guy that put on a suit, went to school wearing a suit because you thought all the other guys are wearing cowboy boots and mullets. I'm going to put a suit on. I'm going to impress this chick. And then everybody just makes fun of you for being the weirdo that wore a suit. But you got the attention, right? You attracted the attention. It may not have worked out how you wanted, but you got the attention. And I am definitely not talking from personal experience here. But attractor patterns, attractor flies do the same thing. They just grab the attention of the fish. They may not necessarily be something that the fish are going to eat right then, but they're usually something that is close enough of a match to what should be in the river that the fish will look at it and think, oh yeah, that's a thing. And then if you have another fly on behind them, they'll see, like if you put a scud on behind your egg, they'll see the egg. They may not move on it, but then their attention's looking there. They'll see that scud and they'll go smack it. At least that's what we've convinced ourselves happens with these attractor patterns. And that's what we think happens with them. There's no way to know for sure with fly fishing. There are no hard and fast rules and truths in it, but that is something that we observe that happens quite often. So that's what an attractor pattern does. And that's why eggs work so great as an attractor pattern. I fish them pretty consistently throughout the entire winter. They're just really, really effective to have on hand. Now, if this seems like a lot to remember, I know I kind of blew through it a little bit. Don't worry, because we've actually got a free year-round hatch chart that puts all of this information on paper so you don't have to memorize it. And I've thrown a link to that in the show notes. If you want to take a look at it, grab your copy. That will certainly help you remember this stuff and then continue to work to commit it to memory. Because believe it or not, eventually a lot of this stuff becomes second nature. The timings of hatches, what flies to use, what matches what, it all becomes second nature eventually. It's very overwhelming when you start. The first 2, 3, 4, 5 years you can still feel like you don't quite understand it, but it does become second nature the more and more you do it. All right, let's move on to the actual list. Now that we've talked about the bugs that these flies are going to imitate, let's talk about the flies. Most of these flies are going to be trout specific. You can use all of these to catch trout, but like I said at the beginning of the show, there are a few on here I put specifically for bass because winter bass fishing can actually be a pretty worthwhile pursuit, especially if you don't live in trout country, if you're down southwestern U.S., southern U.S., anywhere it doesn't get too cold to fish. Really, the bass are going to be active. I was actually reading a story about winter bass a while ago, and apparently some of the biggest bass caught every year are caught in January, February, and March. So it could be a really good time of year to get out and catch a giant bass. And I'll talk a little bit about technique for these bass flies when we get to those as well. And if you're watching along on the podcast, I've got pictures of the flies popping up on the screen for anyone who's interested in looking at them or tying them. So starting off with our first fly, it's going to be the egg bomber. This is a VFC pattern. I believe Alex came up with this. I might be wrong, but I hope I'm not. I'm going to give him credit for it anyways. We'll just say Alex came up with it. Dadgummit, he invented it. It really is, though, the best egg fly in existence. It's very durable. It's very easy to tie. They sink like a rock. And then, like I mentioned earlier, they're a great attractor pattern. I like these in a size 14 to 16. I don't go much bigger or much smaller because I try to keep them around the size of what an egg actually is. And then we only ever tie these in one color I believe it's called fluorescent orange, is the color of the yarn that we use. And then Alex will throw a matching orange bead on. I don't have any orange beads. I'm all out because Alex keeps saying he'll get me some and then he takes them to tie his own flies with, but I'm not bitter about that. But if you have a matching orange bead, it's a great touch, but it's not necessary for the fly. Up next is the Scud Muffin. This is another VFC pattern, and I actually asked Alex to write about this one and to tell the people about it. So this is all from Alex. He said, this fly was actually a recommendation by the guy at a local sporting goods store a few years ago. He showed it to Alex, and Alex was like, and he was like, dude, this thing rocks. And so Alex says he thinks it looks interesting. So he grabbed 2 or 3 of them, and then he gets to the river. It's a real cold winter day. He's browsing his box. He thought he'd give it a try. And then on his first catch, not kidding, Alex goes ahead and catches a fish. And then he just has an absolutely epic day with those Scud Muffins throughout the rest of it. And since that time, he started tying it himself, trying out different types of chenille for the Scud body, different colors. Pink has been the best producer for him, but tan has been a close second for him as well. It's very easy to tie. And then Alex thinks it's so effective because the bottom is buggy and then the top is just a hardened UV resin. So it gives off that very natural scud and sow bug shape. It looks very close to the real thing, but then that UV layer is also going to help the fly cut through the water and sink a little bit quicker. And then you've got the tungsten bead on there too. So these things are they're going to get down into the strike zone and they're going to stay there. They're going to be an effective fly. So that's Alex's take on the Scud Muffin. And I back it all up. They work very, very well. Our next fly is one I reckon we're all familiar with, the zebra midge. This is one of the GOAT patterns, the greatest of all time. And we talked about midges earlier in the show, so this is the first of the midge that we're going to have on here. The zebra midge, it's just time tested. It's going to work. I've caught some of my biggest fish ever on zebra midges in the middle of winter. I like these in brown, red, black, and olive in sizes 16 to 22. A few years ago when I first moved to Wyoming, I was out fishing. I actually hauled my wife out with me. She went out with me in the middle of February on the river. You want to talk about true love? That's it right there. And I was fishing, and I had a little zebra midge on and hooked into what ended up being a 25-inch rainbow on a zebra midge, which was really, really cool to see. One of my biggest fish I've ever caught on a fly rod, one of my biggest trout, period, that I've ever caught, came on a little size 18 zebra midge. And then I moved from that part of Wyoming up to where I'm at now, and I was fishing another river. This was last winter, I believe. And it was stupid cold. It was like 14 degrees when I got to the river. Just, you step out of the car, your snot freezes in your nose, and you feel it in your bones. Your blood temp drops like 5 degrees instantly. You ask yourself what you're doing. And then you look at the river and it looks so good. And you think, oh, let's just take a couple of casts. And in my case, I had a size 16 olive zebra midge on. And I think third or fourth cast is when it hit. A fish came and took it, and it was a 23-inch brown, which is, I think, the biggest brown trout I've ever caught on a fly. I've caught some bigger ones trolling. I fished Lake Ontario earlier this year and caught a nice one trolling, but I wasn't fishing a fly. So that was the biggest brown that I've caught on a fly, was on that little zebra midge. So I can't talk this fly up enough. You need zebra midges. Now, there's another midge pattern you need as well. This is our next one. This is the demon midge. This is also another VFC pattern. The demon midges are just, they're bright red, and they're slightly longer versions of midge larva. So it's a little bit longer. It looks almost like a tiny, tiny worm. It works as both an attractor and a very good natural imitation as well. And just a couple of weeks ago, Alex caught his personal best, the best fish he's ever caught, other than meeting me on the river, of course. Came on the zebra midge, 25 1/4 inch rainbow trout. I got to net it for him. It was really cool. When this fly that we sell, it comes in red. It's only in a size 18 in our collections, but we tie it on a stimulator dry fly hook, which gives it a little bit more length and a slightly different shape from a normal midge. But if you want to tie your own based on these pictures, then anything in sizes 16 to 22 is going to work very well for you. Up next is the Squirty Worm, a really time-tested pattern. Worms are going to be out there in the winter. They're a great bug to have on. The Squirty Worm is a really, really good one because it's just got some extra color and movement over the standard San Juan. The San Juans definitely last longer. Squirmies don't last too long, but I think the Squirmies just work a little bit better. And I just had one of these save the day for me not too long ago. I was out on the water fishing, spent 3 hours fishing and not catching anything. Finally switched out my bottom fly, put on a Squirty Worm, and third cast in, I caught an 18-inch rainbow on the Squirty Worm. So they work. They're an effective fly. Any color really works. I like mine in a size 14 to 16. Alex likes to tie his on a size 12 hook, but then he proportions it like it's going to be a size 14. So he doesn't use the whole length of the shank of the hook because that bigger hook gap on a size 12 helps with the hookup rate. So that's a little pro tip there you can use. Our next fly is going to be the Rainbow Warrior. It's a little bit like a mayfly or a midge nymph in shape and proportions, but it's all flashy, like it's dressed up for the prom, like me wearing the suit to high school to impress the girls. It didn't work. Except the Rainbow Warrior actually works. This fly this fly does work, I promise. It's a great attractor pattern, but it can often be effective when midges are hatching as well. I like these in sizes 16 to 18. Up next is going to be your Frenchie, and yes, a Frenchie is going to imitate your caddis or your mayfly nymphs. And even though those aren't active during the winter, fishing one of their imitations, especially in a larger size, can function as an attractor, and then it can also serve as the weight in your rig to get your flies down deep. You can fish it a little bit larger, maybe in a 14. Most of my Frenchies are 16s, but you can fish a little bit bigger in the winter just to help get your flies down. That way you don't have to have a split shot with them. I like these in a size 14 all the way to 18 in the winter, but even a size 20 can be great as well. Sometimes the fish will want them, especially if they're up and eating. I was out on the water just a couple of weeks ago. It was plenty cold here, but the fish were up. They were eating. There was a little bit of a midge hatch going on, and the fish were eating. So I had a midge dry fly on, and then the only really tiny nymph I had was a little size 20 pheasant tail. I don't know where all my small midges went, but I just couldn't find them that day. So I put the pheasant tail on anyways, thinking, it's close enough. And I caught 2 or 3 on it. So they will work sometimes, especially when the fish are actively looking up. And then again, as that attractor. Up next is going to be our Griffiths Gnat. If you get a warm day, the midges are going to hatch like we talked about. And when they hatch, they're tiny. So a Griffiths Gnat is a great way to imitate all the clusters of midges that gather on the surface to mate and to lay their eggs. I like these in a size 18 all the way down to a 22. Alex personally has a lot of success with them in a size 16 as well. He thinks it's because it looks like a really big cluster of midges and the fish will move on that. But I always fish mine a little bit smaller. I do just fine as well. So we could honestly say a 16 to a 22 and you'll be in business. Up next is going to be your Parachute Adams. Again, if you get into a hatch of midges, you want a dry fly or 2 on hand. I would recommend having a few. And a small Parachute Adams, this fly can do some work during a midge hatch. It may not catch all of them, but it's going to catch a few for you. It's the Parachute Adams. It's that fly that just brings its lunch pail to work every day and just goes. You don't have to tell it twice. You don't have to ask it. You don't have to give it more instructions. It just works. That's the Parachute Adams. You can use these either to imitate a midge if you're fishing a single dry, or they work really well if you throw a little bit larger one and then your small Griffiths Gnat behind it. That way you can see the larger atoms and use that almost as an indicator for when the fish take your smaller Griffiths gnats. So that can definitely help as well. Parachute atom sizes 18 to 22 is going to be what I recommend for the winter. Up next is going to be our woolly bugger. This works for trout, but they also work for bass as well. Now, the key with winter bass, and the rest of the flies on this list are bass-centric. They will work for trout, but I put them on here thinking about our wintertime bass anglers. And the key with winter bass is to move your flies a lot slower than you normally do, and really, really focus on finding the right depth, figuring out where those fish are holding. They're still going to be around structure, but the depth is really key in the winter. Bass slow down in winter just like trout do, so they're going to be eating less, and then they're not striking near as quickly. They're not going to be as aggressive with the strikes. They're still going to eat, but they're not going to blow things up like they usually do. So slower retrieves are key with your streamers, and if you're fishing streamers in the winter, the same goes for trout as well. It's not always going to be this fast, hot, and heavy action. Sometimes it's going to slow down quite a bit. And black, brown, olive, white are great winter colors. I like these in sizes 4 to 10. Now, some folks are going to advocate for fishing big flies for winter bass. Other folks like smaller ones. I'd have a collection of sizes on hand for all these bass flies just so you can dial into exactly what the fish are going to want that day. Your next one's going to be a Clouser minnow. This is another fly that's highly recommended for bass in the winter. Clousers just work. I've used them on bass. I've used them on trout. I've used them on dolly varden in the ocean. They're just a great fly. They come in the traditional green and white combo, which is great, but a darker brown or white or a white gold combo would be really good in the winter. And then sizes 4 to 10 with this as well. And our last fly on the list is going to be the Game Changer. You want to focus on the drab colors with the Game Changer. This has got a lot of movement to it, so it's really good at, especially if you're in really slow dead water, or even if you're on a pond or something. The Game Changer's got so much movement to it. Even a slow retrieve can really trigger a fish, a bass or trout to eat. And then again, focus on those drab colors and in sizes 4 through 10. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you can see how we talked about our scuds, our sow bugs, our midges, and our eggs, and that since those are the bulk of what's active in the winter, you can see that's reflected very much in the winter flies that I recommended here as far as what to have on hand and make sure that you're ready for winter. And if you've got any more questions about what we covered there, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, but don't go anywhere, folks, because we've got the Q&A section of the show coming right up.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from viewers and listeners just like you, and often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well. If you've got a question that you would like answered about fly fishing, then go ahead and send those in. There's a link to submit your questions in the show notes. And our first question this week comes to us. Ben from Colorado writes in and says, I currently use Crocs to wade in, even with my waders, and I'm surprised I have not lost them in the thick sand in the bank of a river. All of the fly anglers around me tell me I should look for some wading boots. What kind of wading boots should I get? I have stocking foot waders, but I also like to wet wade, so how should I size these boots? Corkers has switchable felt and rubber soles, which seem good for all situations. Any advice on this would be great. Thank you for all you guys do with this show. Keep it up. P.S. My wife cannot decide between Diet Dr. Pepper or Diet Coke. Some wisdom on that end would be much appreciated as well. Ben, you tell your wife, both are acceptable, but Diet Cokes can build a strong marriage. I'm going on 4 years being married. And I mean, if there's one thing I know after being married for 4 years, it's everything about marriage. So just go ahead and have some Diet Coke. You'll thank me later. I appreciate the question, Ben. So I've heard a lot of things, but I've never heard somebody wearing Crocs while they're wading. So that's very interesting. The downside, there's a few of them, to wearing Crocs while you're wading is the Crocs got holes in them. So that's going to let a lot of rocks, sticks, and other sharp objects, other debris in the water flow right into what you're standing on, right into your shoes, and then you're going to grind into that with your neoprene boot feet on the waders. You're going to wear through those very quickly. In fact, I'm surprised you haven't sprung a leak yet, to be honest with you. The wading boots are going to keep a lot of that junk out. And then on top of that, boots are a ton more stable. They offer way more traction in fast or slippery waters. They're so much better with ankle support as well. So if you can roll your ankle on a flat surface like I can, and you can ask Alex, he's watched me do it. It's kind of embarrassing sometimes. The wading boots are a lifesaver sometimes. Now, our whole VFC crew runs Corkers. Can't recommend them highly enough. They're fantastic. They've got all sorts of different price points and features to cover you. And I use all of my different Corkers to wet wade. When you size your boots for your waders, you'll follow their sizing instructions. And then all you need to do when you wet wade is just put on some wet wading socks. Corkers sells some. They even make a wet wading insole that you can use to give your feet a bit more security when wet wading. I actually recommend buying that. But you'll use the same boot between the wet wading socks and then any insole that you use. It's going to be about the same size as your waders, as the stocking feet on your waders. So you don't need a separate pair for wet wading. One pair is going to take care of you. As far as the soles, felt is good, but it's absolutely awful in the middle of winter because the winter or the snow and the ice are going to stick to it. And I actually wore some ice fishing once back when I used to ice fish. It was all I had. I just grabbed some my wading boots, threw my waders on, figured I'd stay warm that way. And I remember I had like a foot of snow just glued to the felt. I couldn't walk. It was so awful. So I would recommend against felt for the winter. And then felt can also transfer invasive aquatic species from river to river, mud snails and other tiny little things that can actually wreck a river's ecosystem. And Alaska's actually banned felt completely for that reason. You cannot wear felt wading boots in Alaska. And personally, I used to really love felt, but I prefer studded rubber soles because they're plenty good in the river when it comes to traction. And then when you've got to walk, you're going to put some miles on them. They're really good for that as well. They're much better than felt. So that's what I would recommend for you as far as wading boots goes. But definitely get some. Definitely retire the Crocs. You'll thank me. Your ankles will thank me. In fact, I'm still surprised that you haven't hurt yourself wearing Crocs out on the water. I'm just glad you're out there fishing, though. So thanks for the question. Appreciate it. John from California has got our next question, writes in and says, how do you know what size strike indicator to choose when going nymph fishing? Well, John, I called in the nymphing expert himself, Alex Stultz, co-founder of VSC, to help answer this question as well. Alex nymphs way more than I do, so he is, all kidding aside, a lot of nymph questions I throw his way because the way that I nymph is different, and the way that I employ nymphing is a little bit different than a lot of folks because for me, I don't want to say it's a last resort. And I was actually thinking about this quite a lot lately because I was reading a fishing story. It was in Casting After Water by Dave Karzinski, which is a great book. I recommend if y'all are looking for a new fishing book. Fantastic. Karzinski's a great writer. But anyways, he was talking about how life's too short to specialize in something. For him, he just wants to catch fish. He doesn't care if it's on a nymph or on a dry fly or on a streamer. He just wants to catch fish. And I admire that. And I understand that attitude as well. But on the flip side, life's also too short to not do something you love. And I love the dry fly. That's where my heart lies with fly fishing. So that's why a lot of the times I know how to nymph and I'm fairly comfortable. I'm completely comfortable with going out and nymphing and getting into fish. But my mindset about it's a little bit different because of that, where it's not that I specialize in dry fly or I refuse to fish dries. It's just that's what I like to default to first. If there's a way to fish a dry or a dry dropper, I will do that overfishing nymphs just because that's what I enjoy. There's nothing wrong with nymph fishing. There's nothing lesser about nymph fishing. And especially if you think like Krasinski does, where you just want to catch fish. I mean, nymphs, dadgummit, they're effective. they're way more effective than dry flies a lot of the time. So a little bit of a tangent there. I'm sorry, but I like to pull Alex in on these because, again, I like his perspective on it because he views nymphing much more like everybody else does, where it's just another tool in the box. Whereas for me, I don't want to say it's something I resort to because that makes it sound bad. Yeah, I resort to nymphing if I have to. If my dry fly's on my bamboo that I can see through my monocle and my pipe smoke, if that hasn't worked, then I'll resort to a nymph. That's not the attitude I have at all. Anyways, to actually answer your question, John, generally you're going to use a smaller indicator for smaller flies. Bigger indicators are going to support bigger flies, but you can still use a big indicator with small flies if you want to. The downside to using a big indicator with small flies is that big indicators aren't as sensitive. They cover more surface area on the water. So to make them move and to indicate that you've actually got a strike, the fish have to pull harder against them. They've got to move more than they do with the smaller indicators. And when you've got small flies on there and a big indicator, that take might not be hard enough for you to actually see it and realize, oh, I got a take. So smaller indicators can be a bit more sensitive. I personally only have small and medium-sized bobbers in my vest right now because I like the sensitivity that I get from the smaller bobbers when it's time to use them. And then Alex's 2 cents on this question as well was, he says he will change his strike indicator size based off the size and type of the water that he's fishing as well. So if Alex is in a smaller stream with spookier fish, he will put on the smaller indicator instead of the medium one that he usually fishes, because that smaller bobber, if he's fishing really slow moving water or the fish are spooky or whatnot, it's going to land with less of a splash. It's going to cast less of a shadow. It's going to be a bit more subtle, a bit more sneaky than the big one. So that's another way to look at it as well. But hopefully that answers your question. I appreciate you sending it in. Paul from Colorado writes in and says, love the podcast, guys. It has really got me recharged and energized to spend more retirement money. I am more interested in winter fishing, but what insulated pants do you guys use over merino long underwear? I am after a quality middle layer to go over undergarments and between waders. Thanks, and keep up the great work. Paul, I'm more than happy to help you separate you from retirement money. If you need any more help with that, please reach out to me. Oh, I'm glad to hear it. And what Paul's asking, folks, is we recommend when you're winter fishing, I say get a wool base layer, and then he's asking what goes over your wool base layer between your waders. And it doesn't have to be merino. Merino is what I recommend. It's the best in my opinion. Doesn't have to be merino though. Any wool base layer is going to serve you well. It's going to keep you nice and warm. Even if you get wet, it'll still insulate. So what I wear over my wool long johns is actually more wool. I put on wool pants. I really like the Thermo 350 pants from Squala, but they are pricey. If those are out of your price range, then Orvis makes an underwater pant. It's fleece lined, and then it's a polyester face, so it's not waterproof, but it's water resistant. I think those are about $120 last time I checked, which for a pair of pants is pretty stinking expensive. But if it's the only pair of pants that you use in the winter, the cost kind of balances out over a while. But if that's still out of your price range too, which I completely understand, well, what I used to do before I dumped the money into fishing specific clothes is I just got a pair of fleece pajama pants over my wool, and that worked great. Fleece sweats or fleece joggers are going to work too, but just whatever you do, don't wear cotton. Fleece is going to insulate better. It's a little loftier, and then when fleece gets wet, it's going to insulate better than cotton does when it gets wet. Fleece and wool, again, they're the best because they still insulate even when they get wet. And I used to fish a lot with this crew of guys. And shout out to Andrew, Clark, and Jesse, if y'all are listening to the show from high country anglers. And they would always make fun of me for showing up in my pajama pants in the winter. But I was always warmer than them because Drew would show up in like his jeans or something. And he'd always complain that he was cold. No, Drew never complained about being cold. But it was funny because I was always the one wearing pajama pants, but I was always plenty warm too. So pajama pants over wool will be just fine. Just make sure they're fleece and stay away from cotton no matter what. Fleece or wool pants, wool base layer, wool socks, that's going to be your best friend. So thanks for sending that question in. I appreciate it. Craig from Missouri has our next question. Writes in and says, I occasionally see trout jump clear out of the water, flipping their tails before splashing back into the river. Why do they do this, and what, if anything, does it tell me about trying to net them? Well, Craig, that's a great question, and props to your observational skills for watching and then writing and sending this question in. That's fantastic. What you're seeing is probably one of two things. The first is that fish will jump all the way out of the water to eat the adult version of bugs like caddisflies or damselflies. Because caddisflies, even though all of our caddis adult imitations, we just cast and let them sit on the water, actual adult caddisflies very rarely do that. They're bouncing along the top of the water. They might sit on the water for a second to lay their eggs. They don't sit on the water for 50, 60, 70, 100 feet very often. That's pretty rare. The fish will eat them, though, because, hey, it's an easy meal. They'll come up and grab them. They know what a caddis looks like. They're going to go after that when they have that opportunity. Like me with wings. You put me anywhere near a wing joint, unless it's B-dubs, I'm going to go try it. But anyways, when the caddis are bouncing along the top of the water, or even if they're up above the water a little bit, fish will jump all the way out of the water to eat them. We've actually got a shot of that. If you're watching the podcast, it'll be playing right now, where the caddis really do jump all the way out of the water to eat those caddis, where the fish jump all the way out of the water to eat those caddis. So that is one possibility, is they're eating adult bugs. Now, the other possibility is they are jumping out after an emerger. Now, I know that I've talked a lot on this show about how emerger eats are soft, they're subtle. The fish very rarely breaks the surface. You usually only see their dorsal and their tail fin break the surface when they eat emergers. And that's true most of the time. But sometimes when these emergers are going, they'll be chasing the emergers up through the water column. And I see this more in still water than I do in rivers. But the emergers will be shooting up through the water column, and that triggers a reaction from the fish. If the fish is down lower and it sees this emerger just shooting up by it, then the fish will almost rocket up after it, grab it, and then their momentum carries them up through the water, and they splash back down into the water. So that does happen sometimes. I see it with a lot of chironomid hatches, especially in some of the high country lakes where the fish jump clean out of the water because they're chasing the emergers. There's nothing on the surface, and that's the telltale sign that it's going to be an emerger. If there is nothing on the surface or in the air, but the fish are still jumping clean out of the water, it's a pretty safe bet that they're eating that emerger. Now, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, what an emerger is, aquatic insects go through a life cycle where they start out as a nymph. They're very basic. And then when they go from the nymph form to the adult form, which is the dry fly form that's up above the water, they go into this stage called an emerger. And that's the life cycle stage that I'm talking about here. And we've actually got an entire fly selection masterclass that goes into everything about life cycles and all this terminology, so you can be more knowledgeable about that. And I'll link that fly selection masterclass in the show notes for anybody who is interested in watching it and learning some more about it. So hopefully that answers your question, Craig. I really appreciate you writing in. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up the Q&A section for this week's show, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right at you. Every week, we end the show sharing a story from a listener about their time out on the water living real life, because we are all about helping folks have a great time out on the water, and we want to hear your stories about you living real life. There's a link to submit your Live Real Life moment in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from AJ. Writes in and says, last week we were at my wife's family reunion in Flaming Gorge. Of course, I brought my fishing gear with me on this trip with plans to catch loads of fish on this iconic lake. I fished hard for 3 days straight, 5 to 6 hours a day with only one small rainbow to show for all my efforts. At this point, I had thrown my entire fly collection of streamers, nymphs, and dry flies into the lake in hopes of a big smallmouth, but to no effect. I was so tired and frustrated. It was one of those moments when you want to sell all your gear and find a new hobby. The last day we were there, I decided to get in the kayak one last time and head over to a spot I hadn't fished yet. I tied on a small crawdad pattern and cast my line out. As I was stripping the line back in, I saw a huge fish swim underneath me and toward the direction of my fly. My heart started pounding. I stripped the line as fast as I could to try and get my fly where I thought the fish would be, and then I let it fall. Not more than a few seconds later, I felt that tug that only comes from hooking into a big fish with a streamer. It took me almost 10 minutes to fight him to the net on my 5-weight rod. He was a beautiful smallmouth bass measuring 22 inches long and an educated guess of 6.5 to 7 pounds. After the adrenaline wore off and the fish was gone, all I could think about was how I almost didn't fish that day. It was a good reminder for me that sometimes fishing is hard, but that's what makes it so rewarding, and sometimes the persistence of fishing for days on end with little to no success might just pay off with a fish you'll never forget. AJ, that's a fantastic story. Thank you for sending that in. That's proof of concept right there for everything we talk about here at VFC, here at Untangled, because some days you're going to have to grind. Some days it doesn't come easy, but that makes the days when it comes together so rewarding. And catching those big fish is so much fun, especially when there's been a bit of a drought and you haven't caught anything for a while, like AJ here. And smallmouth on the fly are a ton of fun. So I love that story too. And the gorge is one of the greatest places in the world. I love fishing the gorge. It's been too long since I've been there. So thanks for the memories. Thanks for the story, AJ. I appreciate that a bunch. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up the show this week. Thank you so much for listening each week. That's what makes it possible, is the fact that y'all keep listening to the show. If you've got a question you would like answered, please don't hesitate to send those in. There's a link in the show notes. And then if you could, please rate and subscribe to this show wherever you're listening to it. The more folks do that means the more folks this show is going to reach and help out. We've also got links to a whole bunch of other content that can help you live real life and have a great day out on the water. You can click those links in the show description or wherever you see them. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, have a great time, and live real life.